welcome to True Crime with me, Emma Kenny. Thank you so much for joining me. If you are new to this channel, please acknowledge that if you like crime and consistency, then this is a channel for you, because I release content on a Wednesday and a Sunday every single week. If you haven't joined me for a live chat yet, please do. Amazing community. Kenny's Crime Corll is growing. Yes, I am wearing a green one. Green ones have been released. So if you fancy green, don't wear it with red. Red and green should never be seen. Not true. I wear quite a lot of things that are red and green. Just putting it out there with respect. I'm going to be covering a case today that some of you have asked for, and I have heard about it, but it's one of those cases that, I'll be honest, it took me a while to get the stomach to do. I obviously talk about serial killers a great deal, both on this screen here and on TV, and with respect, I have a strong stomach. I really do. But there was something about this case that really got to me, and when I've read about it in the past and seen photographs of it in the past, it's always stayed with me, because I find it really difficult when young people are killed per se. Large numbers of young people being killed is something that clearly all of us struggle with. And this case just did something to me on that level. So when I talk about Dean Corll today, I do want to advise you that it is one of those that if you haven't heard about, it's probably going to take your breath away. Before I get into it though, let me just say a big thank you to all of you for liking, for sharing the information about my channel with other people, for Patreon supporting me, all of my lovely subs, and also just to tell you that I now have a community available on YouTube. Who knew that you could do that? But you can. There's lots of little extras that you can get if you want to sign up. Obviously, if you don't want to, it's fine. I have a great community here as well, but it is out. And always, as ever, big thank you to all of you supporting me per se, whether that's just a like, it's a comment, you're just having a chat with me on the live chat. It all makes a massive difference. So thank you so much. Like I said, you asked for Dean Corll, and I'm going to do it. I hope that I'm going to do it justice. I've done a very deep dive on this as ever, and even I was shocked on lots of different levels. So we're going to talk about the psychology of him and also the case itself and the outcome of this crime as well. There's some twists and turns. So Dean Corll is somebody who basically slipped under the serial killer radar, in my opinion. When you actually think about the notoriety, the infamy of many serial killers, let's talk about John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, Ed Kemper, Dennis Rader, and a whole heap of others. We know their names even if we don't know their crimes, because so many people talk about them constantly. There are shows, documentaries, and obviously channels like mine that talk about them. And you kind of imagine that at least for the Western world serial killers, we will have an understanding of their names. But Dean Corll isn't one that strikes you as somebody that you might connect with serial killings, and yet it's unbelievable that we don't know more about that and him, because it is insane the amount of individuals that he actually killed. Now, one of the theories as to why Dean Corll hasn't got the notoriety and infamy that others have is because when he was killing in, I would say, the serial heyday of the 1970s. But at the time, he was actually considered to be the most prolific serial killer in US history. The most. However, as I said, in spite of the fact that at that point he was considered the most prolific serial killer, we then had John Wayne Gacy and Ted Bundy, for example, and even though Corll had a terrifying kill count, unfortunately, the two I've just mentioned usurped that, and they actually exceeded it, and therefore the concentration and focus became on serial killers with an even bigger body count. So let's look at Corll. Well, first of all, he was a pederast, so that means that he preyed on young men, and they were Caucasian young men and boys, typically teenagers. So that's how we would classify him, as a pederast. He didn't just kill his victims. He was an individual who seemed to take a great deal of pleasure in what he did. He was a serial rapist, he was a serial sadist, and he had a real penchant and enjoyment of inflicting pain on his victims. But it wasn't just about inflicting pain, he enjoyed humiliating his victims deeply. And they would be subjected to horrific sexual assaults and horrific sexual torture before eventually, when he had had his way with them and he felt the time frames had reached their limit, he would then kill them. Now, Corll was unusual as well in the serial killer world. And the reason that he was unusual in the serial killer world is, as most of you will be aware, serial killers tend to, on the whole at least, work independently. He wasn't somebody who operated alone. He actually ended up with 2 accomplices. And it was essentially their assistance, their help, combined with respect, a whole heap of police complete incompetence. Honestly, back in the 60s and 70s, I'm surprised anyone ever went to prison. A lot did, who weren't actually guilty, it seems, because incompetence goes both ways, doesn't it? Incompetence means that people who are completely innocent just get roughhoused into admitting a crime they didn't commit and then put in prison forever, or put to death, which is even worse, or people just weren't brought to justice because at the end of the day, the police didn't really thoroughly investigate the crimes. But nonetheless, because of this incompetence, and because obviously genetic DNA profiling, etc., had not found its place, and because they had other people involved in the crimes, it meant that 28 young men would lose their lives in less than 3 years, which is an enormous body count. It really is. Even in serial killer territory, over that kind of short period, and bear in mind, we all know that one of the things that makes a serial killer is a cooling off period. Sometimes people will cool off for years. Not this guy. There was a real escalation in his killings that I'll talk about later on. However, as we always require, let's explore what made this man. So Corll was born on the 24th of December 1939, a nice Christmas present for his parents that ultimately turned out not to be a gift at all. So he was born in Fort Wayne, Indiana. He was the eldest child of Mary Emma Robinson and Arnold Edwin Corll. Bear in mind, what do we say about organized serial killers, guys? That's right, they tend to have the highest birth order, and here we have a guy, tick, absolutely, firstborn. Yes, for those of you watching who are the firstborn in your family, you are more likely to become an organised serial killer. I'm not saying you will be, just saying you're more likely. But for those of you who are listening going, yeah, I've always worried about my older sister or brother, if you happen to be a low birth order, such as number 4, you are more likely to be a disorganised serial killer. So you don't even get to be organised, which is kind of worse, with respect. Those, as a couple, had a turbulent marriage, and they actually got divorced in 1946. Let's all consider the reality of what that would be like in 1946. It's not like now, where you can just go to Tesco and buy an off-the-shelf divorce package at a reasonable price. Back in those days, it was seen as a thing of shame, and it would be really difficult for any child being in a scenario where their parents split up. Divorce was not considered acceptable per se. So societally, that shows a level of dysfunction in the family, and also the way that the world around that family may perceive them. They actually reconciled briefly in 1950, whether that was because they felt that they should be together because of the way that society was around them, or whether it was indeed the fact that they'd missed one another, who knows? But they get together again in 1950, but they get divorced in 1953. I will note that from reports, even though they got divorced again for the second time, they were like, didn't work out again, probably should have known that on the first attempt. They actually were very amicable on the second divorce, so that's good. Corll was actually described as a very serious, quiet child, and he was regarded as somebody who was very sensitive, which is in stark contrast completely to his later exploits. There was nothing sensitive about this young man in the end, but arguably people looking in felt that he was very serious and very quiet. I will bring in the note that just because somebody is serious and quiet and appears sensitive, it doesn't actually mean that they are. For example, they can just be quite a withdrawn character because their fantasies and thoughts and dreams and aspirations lie, shall we say, in dark predilections places, which means that he may not have felt like he wanted to be a part of the wider world because he had a preoccupation with what he was forming in his mind. Nonetheless, if we take it at face value, clearly something shifted and he learned to be more confident stroke psychopathic serial killer like as he got older. He did have a few girlfriends as he was a teenager, but it was said that he largely kept to himself. So even though he did form to some degree attachments and relationships that to all intents and purposes were societally acceptable, he didn't do it on a regular, and he certainly didn't have very long-term relationships that then eventuated in marriage. Corll's mother actually later remarried a guy called Jake West. He was a traveling clock salesman, and the family moved to Vidor, Texas. It's here that they started a candy company, which just sounds so lovely, doesn't it? A candy company. I used to work in a sweet shop, not gonna lie, and it sold a lot of candy. It's going back a long time. It was my first job in a shop after my ill-fated paper round that I found exhausting and underpaid, and still I think I walk with one shoulder slightly higher because my bag was so heavy. People hadn't invented those wheelie things that you can use for carrying your newspapers, and we just had a bag on a small child walking a long distance with very, very heavy papers for very little money. Anyway, I did manage to get a job in a sweet shop. It was called Willits at the time, and I worked on a Friday evening. And one of the rules that they had at Willits, because they didn't want any young people stealing from them, was you could just eat as many sweets as you liked. And the mindset of this was, if you ate as many sweets as you liked, you'd get sick of them and then you'd stop eating them. I worked there for 3 years. I never got tired. I did put on a stone, but I had a really good inventory in my head of all different sweets that were available to children who usually were under 18 years of age. And I just want to say, still now, I can remember those days with absolute joy. I liked those sweets, and I cost them probably more than my wages. Nonetheless, I digress a little bit there, but a candy company sounds delightful and delicious. And it actually became a true family enterprise, which I think we can see when somebody starts a company within a family. Often they employ other family members because it's the bedrock of their financial security. Corll and his siblings, they genuinely worked really hard for the business when they weren't in school. Have to say, it's very helpful when you have young children who are able to do such things as, let's arguably suggest that they can work for free. A little bit like my kids at times. So after Corll graduates high school, the family then relocate to Houston, and the reason for this is they want to grow the family business. It's going relatively well, and they open a new shop called Pecan Prince. Now, at this point, Corll is actually living with his widowed grandmother, and he's been there for a couple of years. And he does grow close to a young girl, and that young girl feels that their relationship is intimate enough for them to take it to another level. And ultimately, she actually asks him to marry her, which is very unusual given the years that we're talking about then. There was a very traditional way of a man deciding to court a lady and then the lady agreeing with his proposal when he asks her officially, then spending years starching his shirts and being a good wife. That's what I imagine it was like back then. Anyway, in spite of the fact that he gets this amazing proposal, let's be honest, she took a risk there. Nice girl, confident. Maybe it was on a leap year when it was encouraged, but he basically says no. He rejects that proposal, and he actually returns to help in the family business, which is now located in Houston Heights, in 1962. So he returns to the family business. Now, his mother and his stepfather, who own this business, they actually separate in 1963. And his mother decides that she's going to set up a new business, the Corll Candy Company, And it's basically in direct competition between the stepfathers and ex-stepfathers, so to speak, rival business. But obviously, she's put a hell of a lot of work into this business, and she feels that she's in a position to understand it and to actually create a business that is at least an equal, if not better, to that of her ex-husband's. And Corll at some point is actually appointed vice president of the family business. And I always think that's intriguing when somebody who's quite young gets called a name like vice president, because in a family business you can call your kids anything, can't you? You can be like CEO, managing director, general dog's body. It doesn't matter, you can just pick a name, because nobody's actually going to call you into account if it's not actually representative of what you do. So he's called the vice president, but you can imagine in the local area, if you're known as a VP, that's a big deal. You are seen as a contender in the workplace, and most importantly, you are afforded a level of respect. And psychologically, we have tested this out time and time and time again. If somebody has a title that seems important, people react to those people differently, because they envisage that they will have all of these different traits. This bias of stereotypical perception on success means that these individuals don't necessarily have to do much for people around them to believe that they are worthy or successful in lots of different ways, merely because they have a title. Around this time, it seems that there's the first evidence of Corll's homosexuality arising. And again, it's really worth noting that for men who realise that they were homosexual, it would be a shocking experience, because society was not kind to homosexuals. It's very hard for people in this day and age to really think about that. But to put it in context, my uncle is gay. He's now in his 70s. When he actually realised he was gay, he went to the doctors because he thought there was something wrong with him. He grew up at a time where homosexuality could mean going to prison, and he was basically told to go home and masturbate to pornography, and if that didn't work, go and have electric convulsive therapy. That was literally what he was told. So arguably, it wasn't a time of self-acceptance. It was a time where you would get often rejected by your family. Society was very cruel to you. You were far more likely to be a victim of very violent crime. And this meant that you also were at risk constantly of being criminalized. Can you imagine what that would be like? And to start connecting with the fact that you are interested in same-sex relationships at a time where you were not allowed to be morally, societally, criminally, that would be shocking. And the reason that people start realizing that there is an issue with Corll's particular persuasion is that a young male employee actually complains about the fact that he's making unwanted sexual advances towards him. Now, in response to this, Corll's mother basically fires the employee, which in this day and age would just not happen. You would be behind an employment tribunal and you would lose if you did that, because it's not okay. But back then, she would have been avoiding any stigma and shame. She would want to make the innocent employee the person with the problem. She either has to accept that her son is gay, which she probably didn't want to, or she has to worry that that employee is going to cause problems for her in the long run. So she just decides to sever that contact and that contract, so to speak. And this again sets Corll up to recognise that realistically his actions don't necessarily have to have that many consequences. Because forget the sexuality issue, if we just put that to the side, if we were dealing with a heterosexual man with a woman, we would all be horrified if that woman was having sexual advances made towards her, rebuking those and refuting those, and then she gets sacked. We would all be up in arms, and rightfully so. We would come down heavily on the side of the female, and we should be doing in this case. And for Corll, it means, of course, that he can carry on doing what he does, and even when he's found out, he'll have somebody to defend those actions. Now, like most people who were born in his day and age, there was an issue where you would be drafted into the army. You had service that was expected back in those days. We had it in the UK as well. My father missed that by a few years, where you were literally drafted into the army for a period of time. Some people would still like young people to get drafted into the army for a few years. A lot of people I hear talk about the fact that they think the younger generation would benefit from this, but arguably and personally, I don't necessarily think that statistically that's evidenced when it comes down to people leaving the army. In fact, lots of people on the streets have had issues in the military and had to see pretty gruesome things and deal with awful situations, and it's left them with horrible trauma. So this idea that you put somebody in the army and they just come back all straight up and ready to be great citizens just isn't true, although clearly, thank God we have people who go into the services, they're far braver than I would ever be. But back in the day where they used to literally bring you into the army at a certain age and you do a few years, it would be difficult for people who didn't necessarily feel that they fitted into that life. And Corll struggled. So he gets drafted into the army in 1964 and he hated it. He really did. And whilst he was in the services, he came across kind of a loophole, you would say, which was known as a hardship discharge. So a hardship discharge meant that you had to evidence that you being in the army was causing an enormous amount of problem for a particular area in your life or related to your life. In this case, it was that the family business needed him. Because he applied for it and was successful in gaining that discharge, it meant he got an honourable discharge first of all, and this was after only 10 months of service. So I guess that we can see that he's also somebody who doesn't like accepting situations that he doesn't feel he deserves to be in, and he's willing to motivate himself to move through that, even if he's using something that isn't necessarily completely true. So in this case, would it have been the end of the world if his family hadn't had his help? But nevertheless, he manages to manipulate this and gets out of service. One of the things that he does discover during the time he's in the army, though, is he's around obviously lots of men, and he's able to realise that he is in fact gay, and he does have his first homosexual encounters during his time in the army. So Corll then leaves, as I've said, resumes his duties in the family business, and his job at this point is to basically run the assembly line, and he actually gets named, and this kind of sends chills down my spine for two reasons, because the two titles that I'm going to give you, one has been turned into a horror movie and the other is responsible for making lots of children disappear, albeit with a pipe playing a tune. So he gets called the Candyman, don't say that in front of the mirror 5 times, and Pied Piper, which both for me have very sinister connotations. And one of the reasons for this, guys, just think about how we'd feel about it today. One of the reasons that he gets this name is because he'd just hand out free sweets to local children and teenage boys. Yeah, just have a candy. I don't know who you are, strange man. Have a candy. These days it would be, Mom! But not back in those days. A little bit less suspecting of individuals around them, shall we say. So aside from the fact that he's got this thing about giving out free candy, which obviously he had loads of because he was running a candy company, he would also be seen to take them on rides on his motorcycle. And he also, disturbingly, fitted his white van with cushions, carpets, and a television. I wonder whether he had one of those coat hangers as an aerial. Those of you who are younger, you'll be like, what is she talking about? Why is she bringing in a coat hanger to a television? Would that not be dangerous? She could get electrocuted. No, I'm not talking about in the electrical circuit. I'm not talking about in the plug socket. I'm talking about when I was a kid. Aside from having black and white televisions that should never have been invented, we literally used to get an aerial. Now you have them plugged into the wall, or you have like Wi-Fi that just whizzes it in to your home and it just looks perfect, the picture. But when I was a kid, you would often have to get an aerial that was stuck in the back of your TV, and then you'd inevitably break it. You'd have to get a metal coat hanger and just, you'd have to create a really bad aerial. You'd have to fashion it into some kind of aerial shape. And inevitably, it was harder than you'd imagine. But in the end, if you got it in the right direction, you might get some kind of picture, grainy. This is what he did. He obviously did that. I don't know he did that. But in those days, I cannot imagine he didn't do that. But he had this like kid-friendly white van. And he was known for taking local kids on picnics at the beach. They weren't his kids. They were just kids in the local areas. And he was a really big, broad-shouldered guy, by the way. You'll see from the pictures. And he had thick black hair, he had sideburns, he's always smiling, is what some people said. And he did seem like a very pleasant guy who took kids that weren't his to the beach after plying them with sweets and letting them sit in the back of his van and watch TV, even though they were like half his age. And everyone was like, oh, he's just such a nice guy. Nowadays, we're like, child molester, aren't we? Even if he wasn't, we'd still be like, child molester. And rightfully so. There are the hallmarks of child molestation in what he's setting up right there. It's at moments like this that I think about how far we've come in child protection. Just the fact that I can describe that van and his actions, and immediately we all know that isn't normal psychological behaviour. There is something really off about an adult taking children who they don't know and grooming them, so to speak. And we can tell that. And haven't we moved on such a great deal from the 60s and 70s where child abuse just was under the radar, and even when it was exposed, it was often brushed under the carpet. So we can see how people managed to get away with this in society because it wasn't something that society acknowledged. Even today, I think for any parent looking back at the 80s, for example, you can see that we've come on leaps and bounds. We still have a lot of work to do, but it blows my mind when I hear about cases like this, and it's so obvious that these really scary hallmarks exist and people just think this guy's a really nice guy. So he was well groomed, he was considerate, so people felt that they could buy into this image. And of course, he had a good job, so to speak, so why would anybody be concerned about him? He was also, at the time, when he's taking these kids to the park and to the beach in this van, seeing a single mum. She was called Betty, and she actually reflected that he was a really great guy. Betty, you need to up your choices around men. I know probably Betty has done that by this point, but going back in time, Betty, better life choices. But she basically felt that he was a really top-notch bloke. She didn't think that it was strange even that when they went on dates, he insisted that she brought the kids along. Or in fact, if the kids didn't come with her, he would bring a couple of his teenage acquaintances in tow. So when they went out on dates romantically, it couldn't have been that romantic because her kids were there or some random kids that he picked up were there. Again, if you see it from a different perspective, particularly from a single mum's perspective, she's probably thinking, oh my God, most men don't even want to date a single mother because it's not seen as societally acceptable to the degree that a single guy who is still eligible could meet another single person without any baggage, shall we say, albeit that kids are the most couture baggage you could ever be blessed enough to carry or be introduced to. Nonetheless, that would make her feel that this guy was special. You know, he wants to be around children. She probably saw that as a good thing, and she isn't thinking this is a potential child molester or murderer, is she? And of course, everybody would like to think that this Candyman, philanthropic guy who has these antics involving kids and the beach and doing all these lovely things with them would be seen as altruistic, a good guy. But even those who were thinking that way should have been really concerned when he was seen to flirt with teenage boys and in fact young male employees. So his behaviour was not pure, shall we say. He was known to flirt with teenage boys. He was known to be around young male employees and to be inappropriate, shall we say. And like I said, this also seems to show a confidence that's growing in him, because a lot of men back in these times just didn't want anybody to know that they were gay because society was nasty around that issue and people would feel a level of shame over their sexuality. Thank God it's changed, but back in those era, that's exactly how people felt. One of the things that he used very effectively is his wealth, because people look at people with money and afford them all of these ideas around the kind of person that they are. You know, if you're wealthy, you must be good. If you're wealthy, you have access to all these things I can't afford, which makes you more interesting, and so on and so forth. So he manages to start attracting individuals that he found desirable. And he also decides that he's going to install a pool table in the back room of the factory. And this is just because he wants to attract young teens. And it does. It becomes a local hangout for young boys in particular. Now, one of the boys who regularly went to that pool table and ended up actually hanging out with Corll was 12-year-old David Brooks. He becomes a really important player in Corll's later life, by the way. So Brooks has basically come into contact with him at his elementary school because it's across the road from the candy factory. And Corll starts giving him money whenever he needed it, which you can imagine for a young person who had a level of deprivation in his life, which he did. Brooks is going to feel very special. But also, who doesn't like cash when you're a kid? The idea of being able to just be given money for doing nothing is going to entice you. But there was something else that Corll did to Brooks that made him feel special. He was basically the first adult man in his life that didn't mock his appearance. So Brooks was quite a slight lad and he wore hippie glasses. He was very insecure as a young man, and he would often get called sissy, which was seen as a great slur back in those days. But because Corll didn't do that to Brooks, he started slowly to become a real father figure to him. In fact, Brooks idolized him. And I think when you look at attachment issues, if you don't have really strong primary caregivers that love and look after you and make you feel secure and make you feel that you're a safe place and a foundation for them to return to when they're struggling, if somebody walks into your life who mimics that capacity, who seems to be that safe space, who seems to be that foundation of opportunity for you to just lay your trust down, then you're likely to do that. Brooks came from a really broken home. He also only lived with his father, who was known as a very tough, quote, redneck paving contractor. So that was how he was described. Arguably, if you're a slight young man who's being accused of being a sissy, then arguably having a father who is literally the opposite of that description, you are going to find it difficult to some degree to have a relationship of similarities with that person. So to connect, because we connect over interests and values. And arguably, it could be that the father looked at his son and felt that he didn't reflect him in any way, and that's why they didn't have a great relationship. And it turns out that Brooks' father really didn't have time for him, and he didn't like the fact that his son was also quite a sickly child. So he was the antithesis of what he really wanted in a child. This meant that Brooks actually ended up staying at Corll's apartment quite a lot. However, this was not going to be and remain a platonic relationship. It wasn't going to remain a father-son relationship or a mentor relationship for that long, because Corll had other ideas about how it was going to play out. Bear in mind that Corll is basically more than twice Brooks's age, and we can gather now, looking back, that he was just grooming him, because this friendship, when Brooks hit 14, later developed into a sexual relationship. And Corll would give Brooks money to give him oral sex. Now, Brooks was not gay at all. He had a girlfriend at the time, but he felt deeply dependent on Corll. It was a sense of security that he hadn't had. It was financial security as well. It was a safe space up until then to stay. So letting go of that relationship because he's now being sexually molested, it didn't occur to him in the way that it probably would a child today. There isn't a lot of information about back in those days about child molestation. It certainly wasn't held up as the horrible crime that it is today. So for Corll, he's got this perfect dependent now. He's financially made him feel secure and financially reliant. And also, Corll's been a really good father figure, albeit because he's been grooming him. So now we have a very dependent Brooks, which is deeply problematic for Brooks per se. At this point, there is the closure of the family business. So Corll's mother actually moves to Colorado, but Corll stays in Houston. He finds work as an electrician at the Houston Lighting and Power Company. And this, it seems, is when the killing spree begins. It's when Corll is in his early 30s. And whether part of this transition is because his mother has moved away, so he doesn't feel the same level of societal duty that he may have, a moral duty that he may have whilst his mother was around, because suddenly she's exited. So he doesn't feel that he has to live up to her expectations. And obviously, with that changing, it means that he has, shall we say, fresh ground to consider both psychologically and morally, but experientially as well in his community, because his mother is not around to bring him into line, or to at least make him aware of that nucleus of his family. So she's left. It changes something in him, I believe. His first victim was 18-year-old college freshman Jeffrey Conan. Now, Jeffrey just vanishes. It's the 25th of September, 1970. All he was doing was hitchhiking to his parents' home in Houston. And we all know that back in the 70s, it was so normal to hitchhike. It was just part and parcel of how young people got around. But it also makes it very possible for serial killers to find available and vulnerable and desirable individuals, doesn't it? They can take their pick, so to speak. And like I said, because it was quite normal in the culture to hitchhike, how many people are going to be taking note of the cars that pick people up? It just isn't something that's on their mind. It's believed that Corll offered him a lift. He then takes him to his apartment. He lived on Yorktown Street, and that young man's body was later found buried at High Island Beach in Texas. When they managed to establish the death, it appeared that he'd been strangled. There was a cloth gag found in his mouth, and his naked body, when it was found, was covered with a layer of lime and was also wrapped in plastic sheeting. They also noted that his feet and his hands had been bound with nylon cord. There was evidence when they looked at his body and they did a post-mortem of what was left with his body that he'd also been sexually violated. So it was a really awful thing to discover. In December 1970, a 15-year-old Brooks walks in to Corll's apartment and he just turns up. Bear in mind, Brooks had been staying at his apartment regularly, taking money from him and so on and so forth, and he had this very close relationship with him. So it would not be unusual for him to walk in to the apartment. But on this occasion, Brooks walks in to find Corll naked. Not just naked, he's got two naked young boys tied to his bed and he's molesting them at the time. Corll at this moment in time doesn't respond with, "Oh, Jesus Christ, I've been caught. This is terrible. Please make sure that you don't tell anybody. Free the boys, let them go. What an awful mistake I've made." No. He's instantly on the attack. All that Corll does is demands to know what the hell Brooks is doing there. Think about the arrogance. You've just been discovered by a young man of an age who can absolutely go and tell the police. You've got two naked young men, defenseless, tied to the bed, terrified, and you're also naked. You are banged to rights. There is no way that you can explain this away. Does Corll wither? Is he afraid? Does he try and explain what's happening? No. He's absolutely convinced that Brooks is fully within his control. He's so arrogant and superior. He so believes that what he is doing is no big deal. Think about that. The lack of conscience, the lack of empathy, along with the lack of obvious compassion. This man is not concerned that somebody has literally walked into a, inverted commas, potential serial killer scene. He's just pissed. He's angry, really angry with Brooks, because how dare he enter his domain without permission. So Brooks leaves immediately. This doesn't change the relationship between Corll and Brooks in the fact that Brooks is still welcome in Corll's home. And the next time he sees him, he explains to Brooks that basically he's in this gay pornography ring and he's been paid to send boys out to California to pose for photos. So automatically, he's trying to minimize what's actually happened. And I guess to a young Brooks, that could potentially make sense. But arguably, he's introducing this idea that he's in this child pornography sex ring, which you wouldn't want to advertise to anybody, you sick, depraved, psychologically disgusting human being. But he obviously feels comfortable doing that, and partly this will be because he's having a sexual relationship to some degree with Brooks, and he feels that he's groomed into a point where he will be silent. However, something must shift in Corll's mind, because after he's told him about this child pornography sex ring, or young person's pornography sex ring, arguably he must think, well, Brooks has accepted this. He's not making a big deal about it. He's certainly not threatened me with going to the police, which means that the aversion and disgust that I imagined this young person would feel hasn't come through. So maybe I can push it. That's what I believe went on in the psychology of Corll. I think he decided that he could push this further. And the way he would do that is by testing out the reaction that Brooks had when he told him actually what he'd done. So later, he admits that, you know what, this isn't actually about a porn ring. I actually killed the boys and I buried them in my storage shed. Now that is a pivotal, transformative, sliding doors moment for both. Because for Corll, he's now at a point where he realizes that he can get away with killing and confiding in this young man. And more than that, he can bring this young man into his arena. Now that's deeply unusual, isn't it? Because a follager, this potential for two minds to meet over something so perverse, so dark, so depraved, so disgusting, and for neither to be repulsed by it. That in itself is very unusual. It doesn't matter who you surround yourself with, we all have different shades of what our expectations and acceptance is of the world around us. And very few people would ever believe that killing young men was within the realm of acceptable. Most of us, if somebody confided this in us, may act like, okay, we're not that surprised, we're okay with it. And then the moment we got away, thank God, with our lives, we'd be straight down at the police station, literally singing like a canary, and rightfully so. But the fact that Brooks doesn't respond this way, it shapes and changes the way that this relationship will play out for the rest of each of their lives, and most importantly and catastrophically for their victims. In return for Brooks's silence, there's obviously going to have to be a bit of a persuasive tool, shall we suggest. So what he does is he says, I'll buy you a car. So Brooks is offered a car. Bear in mind, Brooks hasn't got a lot of money. Getting a car is going to be a costly experience for anybody back in that day. And to have somebody just say, well, you know what, I'll buy you one. So Brooks makes this decision, this life-changing decision that will shape his destiny. He agrees to keep quiet. And Corll buys him a Chevrolet Corvette. Just think about that. It's a big deal. The immediacy, the gratification, being seen as a contender locally. You haven't really stood out in your life. You've been a person that people have poked fun at. All of a sudden you're driving around in a Chevrolet Corvette. Haven't even had to pay for it. Brooks is absolutely persuaded by this. And again, for most of us, we'd be like, keep the car, mate, you murdering lunatic. But when you already have a mindset that doesn't fit the normal paradigm, the typical paradigm, and you can be persuaded by these things, well, that car is going to give you some standing in your community, and you're going to like that. Also, we could argue that Brooks saw Corll as a father figure. And how comfortable would he be betraying that father figure? Add to that the fact that there is probably a cynical value within his mindset, which is, well, at least I get cash this way. You know, he's enjoyed being given money, and he's had a poor background, which has meant that the money has given him new opportunities. And also, it seems that it's not just about tempting him with this car and making him feel that, you know, they have a team approach to the life that they're about to create together. He decides that new financial incentives would be something that he would put on the table regularly. And this is where I find this story just so disastrously devastating. Because what Corll does is he offers Brooks $200 for any boys that he's willing to bring back to that apartment to make exactly the same fate happen to them. Imagine that. $200 for Brooks to just go out and procure young men so that Corll can do whatever he wants to do with them. It's mind-bendingly impossible to imagine a deal like that being made. I mean, how throwaway is life? And also, he's asking Brooks to bring back anybody, including friends of Brooks, so that he can enjoy the work that he enjoys doing, which is the molestation, torture, and murder of young men at the very beginning of their lives. It does not take Brooks very long to take Corll up on his offer. First of all, he lures two 14-year-old youths to Corll's apartment, and they're best friends. It's Jimmy Glass and Danny Yates. And when you look at pictures of them, it just breaks your heart. Two lovely looking boys, just best mates. So Jimmy was an acquaintance of Brooks and knew him. Therefore, he trusted him. He was a really handsome, trendy, good-looking teenager. Danny was also a really good-looking lad. He had curly brown hair and he had blue eyes, and they had been attending an anti-drugs rally in Houston Heights, so they were really good boys, pro-social kids growing into young men that our society would be proud of. And all they do is trust somebody that is considered at least an acquaintance, if not a friend. They leave the church service, that's after the drugs rally, and they're never seen alive again. Once they get into Corll's apartment, they are tied to the opposite sides of a torture board. So basically this torture board is made of plywood. It's 2.5 feet wide and it's 8 feet long. The handcuffs were attached to nylon rope at two corners and nylon ropes to the other two. This basically allowed the victim's limbs to be secured in place. They were then raped, tortured, strangled, and they were buried in a rented boat shed. I've skipped through it that way because I don't need to go into the detail. That's enough. It's enough. But those young boys met their end in that apartment that way. Now, their disappearance should have had everybody screaming from the rooftops. These were good boys. They didn't have problems in their home life. They were kids that would not run away. They were kids that had just attended an anti-drugs rally. They were part of their church and their community. They were happy. They disappear. It should have been recognised immediately that this was out of character, out of habit, and it led to an assumption that something bad had befallen these children, but no. In fact, all that happens is what begins to be a pattern. Police say, runaways. They didn't even investigate. They just decided pretty much from the get-go, all it is these kids have chosen to run away. And the reason why? Well, you know, a lot of kids are joining this hippie movement. Yeah? But these kids were an anti-drugs rally. Not being funny, but I'm just going to put it out there. I'm just going to put it out there. I have watched Woodstock. I do know what hippies were renowned for back in the day. And there was a lot of LSD, psilocybin, ecstasy, and a whole heap of marijuana involved in that stuff. They'd just come from it wasn't a drugs rally. They didn't go to a church to be told that it would be great if they went off, joined the hippie trail and got high. Just throwing it out there. They were at the opposite of that. The police should have just connected, but they didn't. Those boys' families, they were left to search on their own. And they did search. They really did search. But they never found those boys because they weren't on the hippie trail. And they had been brutalised and murdered. And every bit of suspicion those family members had played out to be real and true. Now, Corll then moves 5 miles away to the Place 1 apartments on Mangum Road. This is by January 1971. And on the 30th of January 1971, Corll, obviously now with his new accomplice, stroke apprentice Brooks, well, they pick up 15-year-old Donald Waldrop and his 13-year-old brother, Jerry, which I find really difficult to comprehend. We're talking about 2 brothers right now. Imagine the impact on a family. There is never an okay impact, by the way. When you lose somebody to murder, it totally changes the direction of your life. It's incomprehensible. It's tragic beyond belief. It's traumatic beyond comprehension. And think about going through that, but you've lost 2 of your children. So Donald and Jerry come from the same family. All they're doing is returning home from a bowling alley, and they get lured into Corll's vehicle, and of course from there they get taken back to his apartment, and there they suffer exactly the same fate as Jimmy and Danny. They get raped, they get tortured, they get strangled, and then they get buried in the boat shed. Children, brothers, imagine the horror that those poor children were going through. Also, it transpired when I was doing my research that their father, who was actually a builder, he was working on the apartment next to Corll's at the time that they got murdered. Just those 6 degrees of separation, it's horrifying. Again, police completely apathetic. Bear in mind, we've got kids going missing now, and they're like, yeah, whatever. It'll just be that they've run away. I mean, these were 13 and 15. The idea that kids are just running away together every single day is ludicrous. And even though the disappearances are incredibly close to Jimmy and Danny's disappearance, they again just say, nah, these are just runaways. Their father, just heartbreaking this, he camped out at the police station, literally didn't leave. But he was just told constantly the same and the same again. Why are you here? You know the boys are just runaways. Now, I want you to think about that for a moment. Aside from the clear incompetence of the police force per se, I want you to think about the message that gives to a parent. This throwaway idea that you are the problem. It's your home that's the problem. These children have chosen, they have elected to leave your home because you are obviously not providing them with an environment that makes them feel that they wish to stay. So not only are you dealing with the grief of losing 2 of your children who fundamentally you know would never have run away, you're being stigmatized with the idea that there is something wrong with you and your home to the position and point that a child elects to leave. In this case, that 2 elect to leave. The frustration, the trauma, The lack of empathy from those around you because of these kind of assumptions must have been profound and so disturbing. What's even worse is that this father went to the police and said, listen, an acquaintance of mine has seen Dean Corll burying what appeared to be bodies at his boat shed. At this point, I want to find said officers who are given this information so that I can shout at them for considerable amounts of time. Yep, they said that they had seen what looked like bodies being buried in a boat shed around the time of the disappearances of the kids. Also, they noted that this was the weird guy who used to go out taking kids out with him all the time and plying them with candy. I mean, arguably, there were a lot of reasons why the police should have thought, we probably need to investigate this strange man. Barely looked. Literally. They dismissed it as a hoax. As far as they were concerned, it was just somebody making things up. Then we have another 3 teenage boys disappearing. That's between March and May of 1971. So again, he's got the help of Brooks, and this means that Corll can take the boys back to his apartment where they get sexually assaulted, tortured and killed. The first was 15-year-old Randall Harvey, and if it isn't horrific enough that I'm telling you that obviously he died in the most grotesque of fashions as I've described previously, what's even worse is his family actually had a house fire and all but one photograph of Harvey actually wasn't charred. So all of the rest were destroyed at his childhood home in the fire. So they didn't even have their memories of him. And you know, we say, well, our memories are in our head, on our heart, but actually that's not true, because as we get older, we certainly need to have these kind of things that anchor us, and photographs do that. They let us go back and we look at them and we remember things. If they're taken from you, it's more and more difficult to trace those memories. So only one picture remained of that beautiful child. Next, friends 13-year-old David Hilgeist and 16-year-old Gregory Marley Winkle, who was actually a former employee at the Corll candy factory, so the Corll candy company, he was employed there. He last gets seen getting into a white van. Oh, is it the white van? Is it the white van that the guy who used to have the candy shop stroke candy factory? You know, the one with the TV and all the sweets and the kids? Is it him? You know, you'd think at this point, getting into a white van may jog the memory. So let's think about that. So there's a guy who's been seen procuring children off the street in a white van who also arguably matches the description of Corll, who has also been noted as being seen to bury bodies in his boat shed. Are we not at this point thinking the jigsaw is pretty obvious? You know, the pieces are massive and easy to put together, but no. Their verdict was, oh, it's just more runaways. What is so bad about your community that all of the kids are just leaving? Do you see what I'm saying about the Pied Piper and the Candyman titles that this guy was given? It's really, really sinister, because the Pied Piper leads loads of children off to their doom, doesn't he? And with the Candyman, we know what happens in those horror movies. So it's horrible imagining that the police are just completely refusing to take this seriously. Now, David's parents were obviously beside themselves. A child's gone missing, and they've actually learned at this point that they had a friend who drove a Plymouth GTX. So his mother had spotted that model of car cruising the local streets. So she passes on the registration plate to the police because she's desperate to figure out how on earth can we get the police to take seriously that our children have probably been abducted and haven't run away. But it turns out they didn't follow up the lead. Yeah, she hands over a registration plate because people are saying there is this weird car, this car that seems to be cruising around the streets and slowing down where young boys are concerned, and here's the registration, please follow it up. They didn't. But if they had, they would have learned that the car belonged to Corll. So they would have now had even more evidence saying they need to take it seriously, that this man could potentially know what was happening to these boys. And what is happening to Corll's mindset and psychology right now? Well, he is invincible. Literally, you can give his name into the police. No one is doing anything about it. So That, in essence, renders him feeling beyond and above the law, which is a very, very tragic mindset for anybody who's a psychopathic serial killer to embolden. It means that they're going to do more because they genuinely feel that no one is coming for them. Now, a teenage boy who helped David's parents with their actual search by putting up missing posters was 15-year-old Wayne Henley. Henley had actually known David all his life. Like Brooks as well, there was a similarity that he came from a relatively dysfunctional home. It was a broken home. However, unlike Brooks, Henley actually had a physically abusive father who also had a really serious drink problem. So Henley's life was highly unenviable and it usurped Brooks on the dysfunction. We know that Brooks had a dad that he didn't really connect with, but he was still around and providing to some degree for him, whereas Henley had a very different situation. It was an awful scenario at home per se. Towards the end of 1971, Brooks, you will be unsurprised, decides to take Henley to meet Corll. Of course he does. He wants him 200 quid, doesn't he? He's got this person probably lined up as the next intended victim. And Henley clearly goes with Brooks because he trusts him. He probably thinks that he's got an opportunity to meet new people, maybe with money, and so he happily goes there. And Henley had basically met Brooks after dropping out of school, so again, there was a level of dysfunction that Brooks would have noted in Henley, made him more vulnerable, perfect victim. They used to spend time playing pool and drinking beer and also smoking weed together. And ironically, in spite of the fact that they kind of became relative friends, it didn't stop Brooks from introducing him to Corll, which says something striking about Brooks' mindset. I mean, we're talking about $200 that he's given per child that he brings, and he's willing to trade that instant gratification of money for somebody that he's actually spending time with, that he's getting to know. What kind of a mindset does that? Because I think we can all agree that we don't need an assessment of Brooks to recognize there is a real psychopathy there. You know, a narcissism, a willingness to fully exploit things and people that actually aren't doing you any harm and could arguably be contributing towards your life being positive, but you're willing to sacrifice them for $200. That's dark, it's cold, it's incredibly scary. However, in spite of the fact that Henley has all the hallmarks of a potential victim, it turns out he gets on really well with Corll when he goes round. Now, I think that what happens is that Henley and Corll are spending a little bit of time together, albeit before Henley's meant to be taken to his doom, but Corll sniffs out the predatory nature in Henley. He recognises almost instantly another cold-blooded, murdering manipulator when he sees him. Now, Henley would later state that Corll was actually kind to him, and this led to him feeling that he wanted to be around him, he wanted to gain his approval. That was one of the big things that kind of stuck out as far as Henley was concerned. This was a chance for him to be around a man who wasn't, shall we say, abandoning him and neglecting him as his own father was. So, as opposed to kill Henley, Corll decides that he's going to make him the same offer that he's previously made to Brooks. Again, what does that say about the psychology of Corll? He feels he's untouchable, he doesn't feel he's doing anything wrong, and he believes that actually the more the merrier that he brings in to this disgusting band of absolutely the opposite of merry men. He's kind of cultivating this group of boys who he can rely on to procure other young boys for him. And he's so confident that he's bought their silence that he's happy to bring, as I say, more in. So now he's got two young men doing this for him. Now, as with Brooks, Corll offers him money. This is what is the main motivator, along with that sense of belongingness and being special. And of course, both of these boys recognize that he could kill either of them, but he isn't doing. So that again plays into their belief that they are special, they are different to the other boys. And that's a very alluring quality when you haven't necessarily have a caregiver who's made you feel safe. It's completely absurd that he could ever be seen as a safe place when he's doing the most horrific things to people that they're bringing to him. But they see themselves as different. And to some degree, they are different because their mindsets are all so similar to one another than they are to these individuals they're bringing back to the home. But just trying to wrap your head around just how disturbing and dysfunctional and toxic this connection is mind-bending. It really is. And even for me, when I've worked with lots of scenarios and situations where, you know, you have to test your mettle because you can't quite believe the information that's being brought in and the experiences of the individuals who've been through it. But even for me, this was really challenging to imagine these two young adolescents willing to procure innocent young men and children to fall at the hands of this monster. Henley would actually tell the authorities later, Dean told me that he would give me $200 for every boy I could bring him, maybe more if they were really good-looking boys, which is deeply disturbing because he's measuring those boys' value with the way that they looked and actually incentivizing this young man to go out and find attractive boys. Now, initially, Henley didn't actually take him up on the offer, but then his family falls on some pretty difficult times, and therefore he feels that it's an option to bring some money in. So a few months after meeting Corll, he's obviously been playing this through his mind and imagining that maybe if he takes him up on this offer, his family's going to be in an easier situation. So he agrees. But again, it really wouldn't matter if somebody came and said, hey, do you know what? I have £1 million. You're going to have to bring me some kids to kill, but you'll have £1 million every time. I'd be like, okay, that sounds like a great idea. 999 within 5 meters of leaving the house. That's what a normal, well-adjusted human does. And even as a young person, I think we can all agree we would have gone straight to the authorities, or at least to our parents who would have gone to the authorities. But Henley has a mindset where this actually doesn't seem so far outside the realms of rational thought. Sure, it's a way to make some cash. So he agrees. And driving with Corll, this is how it plays out. He's in the car and he's looking for a young man. He sees this long-haired teenager and feels that because he also has long hair, it's going to instantly create this sense of trust. Just going to say, things have changed. I really don't care what your hair's like. I wouldn't get into a vehicle, even if you look like you had almost the same head as me. In fact, that would just freak me out. The point is, most of us have learned you don't get in a car, no matter how nice the people look. So he gets the trust and he manages to understand that that's something that will connect them, and it does. So Henley manages to get this kid to believe that he's going back with them to smoke weed. Goes in willingly, and then of course once he gets back to Corll's apartment, Henley tricks him into actually handcuffing himself behind his back. And I think that whilst on one level we can say, why did that young man not think, this is a bit weird, I've only known you a few minutes, I know we're going to get high together, but I probably shouldn't put those handcuffs on in case you're a bit of a freak. But that's not how we work in life. We have these absolute biases, don't we? It's micro-trust orientated. We have so many micro-trust experiences a day. You don't think when you go back to an apartment with a young adult and a young man who is playing around and having fun that you're going to get murdered. It's just not what goes in through your mind. So when he is asked to put on those handcuffs for a bit of a laugh, Henley actually does it first. So he again builds trust. So Henley has this secret key that he has in his pocket, which means that he can open them. So it looks like he puts them on, but he hasn't put them on in a way that he can't get them off. So of course, when the other young lad tries to do the same, he can't escape. Imagine that moment for that young man. The horror. That this fun afternoon is going to become anything but. In fact, it's going to be his last afternoon. Corll then binds this scared young man with rope. He gags him with adhesive tape, and then Henley leaves. Because remember, Henley leaves at this moment, at least in his mindset, according to what he has been told, thinking that the youth has actually been sold to a sex ring, because he's made out that this is what it's about. There is this paedophile sex ring who's procuring young people, and that's what's going to happen to this young man. Following day, of course, simple situation. He goes round to get his cash, doesn't he? So off Henley goes. He's created this transaction. He gets his $200 for the boy, as promised. But then a few days later, just like in the other case, he finds out, of course, that this boy had actually been sexually assaulted and murdered by Corll. So that in itself is the same way that he entices and tests Henley. Because now Henley could react with aversion, he could reject the offer, he could act horrified, but he doesn't. Just like Brooks, Henley doesn't tell the police. In fact, even when Henley discovers that Corll had actually murdered his close friend, David Hilligeist, the kid who he was going out giving posters of this boy to other people to try to bring him home, even then, he doesn't tell the police. And actually, he just becomes a more and more willing accomplice, and he really does. He buys into this. And when you think about Brooks and Henley, they were perfect accomplices for Corll. I mean, they both came from broken homes, they dropped out of school, and in spite of the fact that they had this dysfunction that made them very vulnerable, shall we say, neither one of them was seen by anyone as a trouble causer. So they weren't seen as youths with problems, not at all. And because of the fact that they weren't known or notorious in any way for being negative or non-prosocial, because of this, automatically young people trusted them. They weren't bad boys. So when they started to have relationships or friendships or call on friends that they had, it was very easy to acquire the trust of their targets. And Henley would actually say that they even knew how to anticipate when Corll needed a new boy. They said he would become restless, he would smoke a lot of cigarettes, and he'd make like reflex sharp movements. And Henley actually once knocked Brooks unconscious in Corll's apartment. They got into a fight. And when this occurred, the way that Corll responded was he tied Brooks to the bed and he repeatedly assaulted him. So when that played out in his apartment, in spite of the fact he has a relatively reasonable relationship with these boys, albeit horrifically twisted, as opposed to protecting Brooks or telling Henley off for doing that, he takes this moment as an opportunity to just assault Brooks. So he breaks any trust in that moment. He violates him. But it's not enough to make Brooks second think this situation. In fact, he just continues to be this willing accomplice in the murders. And I know we can all agree he's groomed him. He's made it financially possible for him to live a life that he wouldn't be living. He feels part of something in this weird, broken, completely dysfunctional, toxic family, so to speak. But even in that moment where he is horribly violated, it isn't enough to break that spell, to break that reality of what this trio are actually doing. And maybe it's because he had been so groomed that his expectation was that there would be sexual violation from time to time. But for me, again, isn't it interesting that for Corll, it's almost like testing more and more the fact that he can get away with these most reprehensible actions and acts on these individuals. And also, it means that his boundaries aren't there. If he's willing to harm the young men who are actually helping him, well, how safe are Brooks and Henley? Because arguably, it seems like they're in a very dire and disparate situation when the man who's meant to be on the same side of them feels so okay harming them this way, or at least in this case, Brooks this way. So now we have Brooks and Henley acting as his accomplices. And because of this, Corll's able to develop a very effective MO, modus operandi. So first of all, he selects victims from Houston Heights. This is a relatively seedy Houston neighborhood. And this means that because it's not necessarily one of the best neighborhoods, the police don't necessarily take that much notice of it, that the disappearances of these children just gets routinely ignored by the police. They're used to dealing with runaways, so it's no big deal for them. And usually the MO included the fact that the kids that were brought to Corll were friends or acquaintances of Brooks or Henley, which again is just horrifying, isn't it? You send your kids out with friends and you think they're safe. And these were wolves in sheep's clothing. These were peer predators. Yes, they weren't the ones doing the killing, but they were setting up the kill without a doubt. Also, Corll would frequently move between apartments and rent houses. So again, he's constantly moving. This meant that sometimes he even stayed in one place for just a matter of weeks. So of course, that's making it less obvious for witnesses to come forward. It makes it more difficult to track who he is and what he's doing when he's moving around regularly. Brooks and Henley would do the same routine. So they would lure the boys into Corll's Plymouth GTX muscle car or his white van. And this would be on pretense of asking them if they needed a ride, or maybe they wanted to go for a drink, smoke some weed, sniff some glue. They also suggested they could sniff some paint or they could take some pills. I know, you don't often hear about sniffing glue anymore. I think it died with the 80s. But back in the day, it seemed to be a cheap, affordable and available scenario that people could engage with. All I remember is the advert said you got horrible spots around your chin, and really, that was enough to put me off any such substance. I didn't want acne. But bear in mind, it's quite an easy ruse, isn't it? They've got a decent car, they seem quite cool, the kids kind of know who they are, and of course, they're not known as bad boys, so why wouldn't they get in the car? And the other thing that was very easy for Corll is the fact that he had money and knew that most of the young people who he wanted to bring back to his place, well, they were always eager to party, weren't they? But they didn't have the financial opportunity to take drugs a lot of the time because they didn't have an expendable income. So it was perfect. He could offer a scenario where they could come back and play, so to speak, with these young acquaintances of them. What was to be worried about? So then the boys would, on this promise, take them back to one of Corll's apartments or rented houses, and this is where Corll would be waiting. They would actually help him strip the boys naked, they would help tape their mouths, they help bind the hands and legs, and they help fasten them with the handcuffs. Sometimes, as I said, they actually went by tricking the boys into putting the handcuffs on themselves, and that in itself is so power play orientated, isn't it? You know, there they are, tricking this kid into putting handcuffs on himself to only realise in terror and horror that he wasn't going to be able to get them off and that something terrible was going to happen. And they actually let that occur. They played it out. So these boys were more than happy to psychologically torture these victims, albeit they might not have been doing the physical. If they didn't put the handcuffs off themselves, they would force the handcuffs on. They would also drug the young boys so that by the time they passed out, it meant that they could do what they wanted. And when they woke up, obviously they would be in a situation where they couldn't escape. Those handcuffs would then be attached to Corll's torture board. And Brooks actually later stated that as far as he and Henley were concerned, the minute that those boys had been attached to the torture board, they were as good as dead. That's what they said. His words, as good as dead. In fact, he also went on to say it was as good as over, but for the shouting and crying. And that just brings it home, doesn't it? We can talk about this in the actions and kind of what played out regarding the physicality of the crimes, but actually what we have to bring it back to is these were little boys. You know, when you're 14, 15 years of age, you just want your mum. And the shouting and the crying, of course, the pain that they were enduring, the fear, the terror, the horror, the desperation. And the fact that these boys were brought there by apparent friends. And for Brooks to actually be able to recall it that way, the coldness, it was all over, but for the shouting and crying. There were dead young boys walking, it's as simple as that. Even worse, the victims were actually at times forced to write letters back to their parents to let them know that they were going away. Or even worse, they were told to physically call the parents to say that they were okay and that they'd be back soon. And why was that call made? Because actually Corll wanted more time to have his fun. Can you imagine making that call to your mum? Imagine hearing their voices, knowing it's the last time that you're ever going to see them, ever again. after they'd done this and either created a scenario where nobody would be looking for the child, or where somebody believed that the child was safe and would be coming home later, and they had time, that's when Corll would start beating and sexually torturing them. And he was horrific in his torture. He would pluck out their pubic hair one by one. He would insert glass rods into their penis and then he would smash them, which is just beyond my understanding of how anybody could even think that up. He would then violate them with things like giant dildos. He even mutilated their genitals. He castrated them at times, beat them very severely, and he would make sure that cloths were shoved into their mouths because then it would muffle their screams. He would sexually molest all of his victims, sodomizing them as well. He would force them to perform oral sex on him, and he would often perform oral sex on them. And then finally, this time it could be after days of torture, he would then kill them. It would either be by strangulation, he would do it manually or with a cord, or he would put a bullet through the head using a .22 caliber pistol. But this could be after days of holding them hostage and brutalizing them this way. And these were young children. You know, you're a kid at 14 and 15, you really are. And sometimes there would be more than one child there. And undoubtedly they would have probably known that they were going to be killed. I imagine he would tell them that during the torture. But imagine having that drawn out in that agonizing way for days. It's just beyond comprehension. And I've took some time to sit back and think about the way that he treated those boys. And yes, okay, we can definitely say he was a psychopathic serial killer who was probably very narcissistic in his nature, had no empathy or compassion, we can see that. But what else? And I can't help but imagine that some of the violence and aggression that he uses towards those young men is also about potential self-loathing. Bear in mind, this is at a time where you were not accepted for your sexuality and where being homosexual was tantamount to deserving to go to prison, being considered mentally ill, and all these horrible things that were assumed fully incorrectly about people who simply love a person of the same sex. But if you have a degree of self-loathing, or you feel that there is a part of you that is attracted to men and you don't feel that it is acceptable, you feel that maybe you are a product of something that is wrong or evil or broken, and that you've been afflicted by this, could you create a level of rage that arguably you could use towards yourself, or you could use it by projecting it on others? Could these young pubescent men represent the part of he that he loathed? So could it be that Corll was so repulsed by his same-sex attraction and had this psychopathic serial killer within him that he brutalized those men as a reaction to the way that he felt about homosexuality? So he punished them because he was so attracted to them. He couldn't just have an intimate, loving relationship with another human being. He was disgusted by that part of himself. So therefore, he wanted to abuse these poor children that represented the pubescent self that he used to be when he probably started to first feel these very genuine, real, authentic feelings of sexual connection with other young men. I don't know. I just think it would be amiss of me not to bring in the potential. That said, all of that in context with the potential of it being about self-loathing, none of that brings in the reality of what he ended up doing, which is brutalizing and torturing and murdering poor innocent boys, and the fact that the vast majority of people who are homosexual do not have issues with anybody else, and actually the issue is far more likely to be with themselves at these points in time because society was so rejective and abandoning of a very normal sexual experience, which is to just love people and be sexually attracted to people of the same gender. It's a possibility, isn't it? But it also is clear that those feelings would never usually play out this way. You would have to have a psychopathic serial killer mindset and belief system that would allow you to then utilize that brutality on other human beings. So Henley and Brooks, after they'd procured the young people, allowed him to have his fun with them, so to speak, They would then help Corll dispose of the evidence. They would then take the naked bodies of these young people in a wooden body box, as they put it, to one of 3 burial sites outside of Houston. That was Corll's storage shed, Sam Rayburn Lake, or High Island Beach. Same way of disposing of the body. They would wrap the body in plastic, they would tie it in rope, usually cover it in a layer of lime, and then bury the body in a shallow grave. It's really incredible to me how willing Henley and Brooks became in these killings. You know, they were more than willing to lure their own friends into the most horrific horror movie deaths that you could imagine, simply in return for a little bit of cash. And the next victim, because we haven't finished yet, was literally Henley's friend, a good friend, 18-year-old Frank Aguirre. Now, Henley had socialised with him, been to Frank's home. He was known as a really fun-loving, popular boy, had loads of friends. He was literally a month away from graduating, and he was engaged to be married. When I think about that, I think, was Henley jealous? You know, was Henley angry that this boy was so popular and so at ease with himself and was succeeding in relationships and was doing well and was graduating? Was that the bit that made Henley think, you don't deserve that, I can't have that. I'm going to have the ultimate power over you. I'm going to stop you having the life that you've dreamt of and worked for. What's really tragic about the fact that I'm going to obviously tell you about the reality that this boy was killed, this young man was killed, his 6-year-old little brother had literally been tragically killed in a car accident just a few years before. So his family were already dealing with this dramatic, desperate loss of a 6-year-old little child. So he actually ends up going with Henley after he's finished his shift at a fast food restaurant. It turns out that Henley, in this circumstance, actually sat and watched as Frank was handcuffed and dragged into Corll's bedroom. So he literally sat there. He watched his friend, whose home he'd been to. He watched him dragged away. Again, he was raped, he was tortured, he was murdered. And again, Henley and Brooks helped Corll dispose of the body. It's just unbelievable. You know, if it isn't bad enough that Henley did that, the callousness that he demonstrates when he goes to Frank's family and actually asks if there's any developments on this young man who's just disappeared into thin air. I mean, that has all the hallmarks of a serial killer, doesn't it? One of the things that we say about serial killers is they keep up with the investigation. And there's nothing more than keeping up than actually visiting the parents of the young man who's missing. The young man who is missing, who you know has been murdered because you took them to their death. He had literally buried Frank's body, and he dared to step foot in their grieving home because even though they didn't know he was dead, they must have thought the likelihood was that he'd been abducted and killed, because this was a man about to get married, his whole life ahead of him, about to graduate, and he just disappeared. But this is what Henley does. That's how cold he is. In fact, it wasn't enough just going and seeing Frank's family and pretending that he was concerned. He even offered to hand out flyers. And he did. He took the flyers and he dumped them in a ditch. Just like he helped to dump his friend in that ditch. Just remarkably callous. And Henley isn't just happy to procure boys now. It's moved on. He starts enjoying getting involved in the killing. So he takes his friend Mark Scott to Corll's, and whilst they're actually trying to bind Mark's hands behind his back, he actually manages to break free, and he grabs a knife and he really very nearly manages to stab Corll. And I wish that in that moment the universe had provided and he had just gutted Corll. I really mean that. I wish he had gutted him. But in that moment, Henley runs for the gun. And when he points at Mark just gives up. Imagine that. Imagine Mark just getting free, managing to nearly stab this man, this perpetrator, this person who wants him dead. And then it's his own friend who turns the gun on him. And he has nowhere to go. You all know what I'm going to say now, guys. In that circumstance, if there's somebody pointing a gun at you, just screw it. Do not comply. Stab the perpetrator. At the end of the day, you might still get shot and killed. That's not ideal, but it'll be a lot quicker. And most importantly, the person who's harmed you will also be in dire straits or ideally dead. But most of all, in circumstances like this, do not comply whatever the cost, because ultimately the cost is going to be your life. Give yourself a fighting chance. I really mean that. Instead, when Mark gave up, Henley then helped Corll just strangle him to death with a cord, which is just horrific. In total, Henley obviously had a thirst for killing, and he actually helped to shoot dead or strangle at least 8 boys. And later on down the line, he admitted that the reason for that was he really enjoyed causing pain. Chillingly, he stated, "You either enjoy what you do," which I did, "or you go crazy." So when I did something, I enjoyed it, and I didn't dwell on it later. That is the mark of an absolute psychopath. A mark of somebody who firstly can enjoy it, and secondly does not have the conscience to ever deal with the guilt and shame that he should actually have to deal with. Instead, for him, he didn't mind doing it. He learnt to enjoy it. He didn't care about the conscience regarding it. He really didn't. This completely recognises for all of us that he has no guilt, no remorse. And there was another thing that really struck me about this particular killer. It's how it intrigued him. He actually said, "At first, I wondered what it would be like to kill someone. Later, I became fascinated with how much stamina people have. You see people getting strangled on television, it looks easy. It's not." Well, thanks for that. Thanks, Henley, for describing just how psychopathic you are, that you feel that you need to compare said television death with actual death, as if it's a point that we need to note. June 1972, 2 abducted boys, this is 17-year-old Billy Bulk and Johnny DeLome, they get tied to Corll's bed. So these youths had already been tortured and raped. At this point, Henley then strangles Billy before shooting Johnny in the forehead, and the bullet exits through his ear, and he's still alive. And he pleads with Wayne Henley, "Please don't." Henley then just strangles him. Again, the level of cool, calm, collected execution of this crime is just terrifying, isn't it? In the end, Henley would personally be responsible for taking more than 20 young men and boys to their deaths. Now, as I've mentioned, Corll was somebody who moved around quite a lot, and following his move to an apartment at Westcott Towers, well, the killings continued, and the victims here included 17-year-old Stephen Sickman, 19-year-old Roy Bunton, friends 15-year-old Wally J. Simoneau, and 13-year-old Richard Hembry. 17-year-old Richard Branch, who was actually castrated before he was shot. And his father, who was a police officer, by the way, he was so devastated by him going missing that he actually died during the search. He had a heart attack. I mean, I think that any parent knows the idea of your child disappearing and you suspecting that they have disappeared because they have met a terrible end. The stress that that would cause is literally enough to break your heart. And actually, we have research now that says people literally do die of broken hearts. The grief and the pain and the stress that ensues is so catastrophic to the body and the mind that it literally kills you. As well as those mentioned, 19-year-old Richard Kepner. He also went missing. Now, all of these were raped, tortured, and then either shot or strangled. But they all met their doom at the hands of this heinous, reprehensible human being who you cannot imagine ever was given the option to walk this earth. Then again, he moves. So this is in 1973, in the January. He moves to Spring Branch district of Houston. Here he kills 17-year-old Joseph Lyles. And it seems like literally wherever Corll goes, death follows, and a lot of death. March 1973, he moves to Pasadena. This is where Brooks and Henley say that Corll's bloodlust just increased. So it went even higher, which is astronomical anyway, but this move seems to provoke something in him, whether it's by this point he feels genuinely invincible and like he can kill anybody and get away with it. But there is nothing reduction-wise in his killings. It just goes the other way. And within a space of 3 months, 3 more young men are murdered. This is 15-year-old Billy Lawrence. So Billy's father was last able to recall speaking to him when he said that he wanted to go fishing with some friends at Lake Sam Rayburn. So his father agrees, of course. He's happy that his son's going fishing with his friends. And Billy promises that he'll be back within 3 days. He ended the call with, "I love you too, Dad." Turns out he was actually held captive and tortured for 3 days because Corll really liked him. His words were used. That's what he described to Henley and Brooks, that he really liked him. And then he strangled him with a ligature. Before that poor young man was killed, he was made to write a letter to his father. And that letter was to tell his father that he'd found a job in Austin and that he'd be back in the August. And it's clear that he sensed he was going to be killed. And the reason that I say that is because the end of that letter had these words: "Daddy, I hope you know I love you. Your son, Billy." Now, we all know that sentence was loaded with sentiment because that child knew he wasn't coming home and he wanted his dad to know without a shadow of a doubt that he adored him, that he loved him, and that he was his son, in spite of the fact that he would no longer be able, at least in this dimension, to be his child. That poor young man was buried at the lake that he actually thought he would be going fishing at. Next to meet their doom this way was 20-year-old Ray Blackburn, just hitchhiking. He'd had a new baby and he was going to see that newborn baby. His death was followed by 15-year-old Homer Louis Garcia and 17-year-old John Sellers. Ultimately, they were shot in the head and chest. They were left to bleed to death in Corll's bath. This man just showed no mercy, did he, whatsoever? In 1 week alone, in July 1973, Henley helped Corll abduct and murder 3 more youths. First was 15-year-old Michael Bulk. Heartbreakingly, you won't believe this, he was the brother of Billy who'd been murdered the year before. And their eldest brother had previously been killed in a car accident at 15. I don't even know how that family would have taken a step in front of another step, because to lose 3 children in such tragic circumstances is beyond comprehensible, 2 at the hands of the same disgusting excuse for a human. The next to be killed after were friends and flatmates that were 17-year-old Charles Corll and 18-year-old Marty Ray Jones. Charles was married. His wife was pregnant at the time. Again, what does that tell you about the psychology of Corll? He doesn't care about anybody. He doesn't care about the family situation. It doesn't concern him who they are, where they come from, what their life meaning-wise has to those around them. All he cares about is using them for his own purposes. He has got literally no conscience, no compassion, no empathy, and most importantly, he has got no concern that he's going to get caught. And even though this is completely my own suggestion, I pose a thought, a question, I'm deeply concerned that this man had such a penchant for young boys and young adolescents, and the police were so disinterested in him. I always worry that where there are child molesters and paedophiles, there are often, shall we say, people helping them to get away with what they do. I'm not saying that certain people in authorities knew about this and were complicit. I am saying it certainly would not be the first time, and sadly it will definitely not be the last. These 2 young men that I just talked about, Charles Corll and 18-year-old Marty Ray Jones, they were actually first tortured and abused, but then they were made to fight each other. And these were 2 friends of Henley, by the way. So Henley witnessed what happened. So after they've been horribly abused in the way that we've talked about prior to this, the friends were made to fight each other to the death. Yeah. They were still shackled to opposite ends of Corll's torture board, but then they were then told that if one of them survived, they would get released. They beat each other for hours. Flatmates, friends, made to fight to the death. But after they'd done this for hours and hours, Marty was literally made to watch whilst Charles was raped, tortured, and then shot in front of him. Marty was then again raped and tortured, and then they strangled him to death. Imagine being party and privy and witness to that. Imagine again the psychological, absolute assault on those young men. Told that if they fought one another to the death, the one that survived would be freed. And they fought because even though they were friends, they wanted to live more than they wanted to protect each other. And they felt that there was going to be no escape anyway, so they did it. And even in that situation, they were humiliated in that way. And then it came to no avail because they were both murdered. And Henley watched that happen. Just over a week after that heinous event that I've talked about, on the 3rd of August, 13-year-old James Stanton Dramela was abducted and murdered. And who knows how many more lives would have actually been taken if it hadn't been for what I'm about to tell you next. Events that unfolded just a few days after 13-year-old James Stanton Dramela had been abducted and murdered. But a twist of fate was about to happen. The 8th of August 1973, Henley took his friends, 15-year-old Rhonda Williams, note the fact, Rhonda, a girl, and 19-year-old Tim Curley to Corll's apartment. Now, he claimed later on the reason that he took them there was he just wanted to party with them. I don't believe this, I'm sure you don't believe it. It's highly unlikely given his history. Anybody he took there ended up dead. Rhonda, as a young girl, she had a really tough life. She'd been raped as a toddler, so she was a survivor. She'd been in and out of foster homes, which, as we all know, is terribly challenging for a lot of children. Not all, but for many. And ultimately, after all of this moving around, she'd ended up back with her drunk and physically abusive father. She was actually engaged to Frank Aguirre as well. So she'd been engaged to one of the victims. So her life had been incredibly challenging and she'd had a lot of loss. And as you know, Frank Aguirre, who she'd actually been engaged to, had been lured to his death by Henley. And what a twist of fate. Here Rhonda is in the very same scenario that her fiancé had found their life snuffed out in. Now on this particular night, Henley had actually heard Rhonda's father beating her up. So he'd acted like a prince in shining armour. He'd helped her escape from the house and suggested that she'd go with him. So she leaves one trap, one horribly domestically abusive situation, and bizarrely gets taken by who she sees as the hero in this scene to an even worse situation, to the House of Horrors, to potentially meet the worst doom that she could imagine. Now they do get there, they get high, they drink beer. Corll's watching intently, by the way, at this point. And as they're watching this scene unfold, Rhonda passes out, as does the other individual that they're with, because at the end of the day, they're being plied with drugs. When Rhonda wakes up, she knows instantly there is something happening that's completely nightmarish. So first of all, she wakes up to discover that Corll is kicking her and screaming at her to wake up. So that's how she comes around. She instantly notices that, one, she has this madman screaming in her face, but she's hogtied. Both her and Tim on the floor. They've got tape on their mouths. And as shocking as this is, I don't think that she would have been quite as shocked as Henley would have been when he wakes up in the apartment in exactly the same predicament. Yeah, he's hogtied by Corll on the floor in the apartment. He is now in the same scenario that all of his victim predecessors have found themselves. It turns out that Corll had been so enraged that Henley had brought a girl to his apartment that, as far as he was concerned, Henley had failed in being the accomplice that he expected him to be, and he is gonna pay with his life. In fact, he says to Henley, "Man, you blew it bringing that girl." Now, I don't know why he was so bummed out by the fact that he'd brought a victim that wasn't male. I don't know whether it was potentially that Corll had a tiny boundary in his serial killing, which was that he would only kill young men. That was certainly the predilection he had, but it may also have been the fact that he had a decent relationship with his mother and he saw girls in a different way, and the idea of killing a girl, even though he has very little conscience, potentially provoked a conscience that he was uncomfortable with. Therefore, he felt that he was going to take that out on his young Henley, who had been his helpful advocate and accessory in all of these scenarios, and now he feels betrayed because he's got a situation he didn't want happening in his home. That could arguably why he decides that he's going to kill Henley. We could also say that he likes having two young men at once, and of course in this situation he only had Tim, so he decides, well, he can always find another Henley, because that would be Corll's mindset. You know, he's had Henley and Brooks, why can't he find another Henley or Brooks? He's got so confident that sacrificing Henley probably isn't a big deal to him. He'd rather have his fun with him and enjoy the kill and then find somebody else to procure young men for him. However, Henley, remember, is quite a manipulator himself. He's been procuring young men to come to that flat constantly, and he's been managing to do that without any suspicion. So he's clearly good with his communication skills, and he just managed to calm Corll down. He promises that he'll help kill the other two. And he says that the way that they could maybe resolve this situation is that Corll can first rape Tim whilst he rapes Rhonda. So Henley is pretty clever in creating this bridge that they can both meet on, where they're both carrying out rapes and where he's dealing with the Rhonda situation. And ultimately, he's becoming essentially an equal by doing that. And this changes Corll's mindset a little bit. So he ultimately agrees, unties Henley. He then takes Rhonda and Tim into his bedroom, ties them to his torture bed. Rhonda's on her back, Tim's on his stomach. Corll strips naked and then begins raping and torturing Tim. Meanwhile, true to word, Henley begins raping Rhonda. Now, Rhonda has been there before, and this girl is a survivor. She really is. She doesn't want to scream. She knows that in her experience, screaming has only ever made it worse for her. She remains calm. And she would later state that up until then, she'd seen Henley as her protector. So she asks him, "Are you going to let this happen?" Now, she wasn't expecting the reply that she got at this point, but according to Rhonda, she said this: "He was afraid that he wasn't going to be able to save me. So he was going to sit down with me, you know, lay down with me like he'd been doing when we talked. And he was going to put the gun to my head while we were talking. And then he was just going to shoot me." I mean, what do you say to that? So I am going to murder you, but I'm going to murder you in a slightly less terrifying, non-torturous way than I could murder you. It's hardly going to be like, okay, that's really compassionate of you. It's like, you are a absolute psychopathic serial killer. And at this point, she doesn't even know that obviously he's been party to murdering her fiance. But this is how his mindset is working. Well, I will just shoot you when we're having a chat. Yeah, and how's that chat gonna go? Oh, just lie down, let's just have a nice conversation side by side like the old days. Well, I've got a 22 caliber gun in my hand, I'm gonna blow your brains out. I mean, it just doesn't register, does it, with him? But this is an amazing young woman. She's clever. And she doesn't fight him. She just tries to help him understand that he's been her protector and that arguably there are alternatives. And it gets to him. something switches. And Henley asks if he could take Rhonda into another room. Bear in mind, Henley has also realised that only moments earlier, he was going to be one of Corll's absolute victims. So not only has he got Rhonda, making him think a little bit differently, at least about her demise, he's also just seen that Corll is quite happy to murder him, to torture him, to rape him, to kill him in the way that he's witnessed so many victims be killed. And he actually says that he wants to take Rhonda to another room, but doesn't get an answer off Corll because he's too focused on Tim at this point. And according to Rhonda, she said something snapped in him. And he spots Corll's pistol just lying on the table, and he grabs it. And he points at Corll and he shouts, "You've gone far enough, Dean. I can't go on any longer. I can't have you kill all my friends." Now, Corll is really surprised by this, gets off Tim, starts walking towards Henley. And Tim would later state, in reference to Henley, "Dean stood up and I saw him change into a different person. There wasn't somebody inside him, and it wasn't him. It was like a spirit from hell." Corll at this point goads Henley, says, "Shoot me," before letting him know that he wouldn't do it. However, wow, if ever you're going to underestimate someone, it's probably not good to underestimate someone who's standing with a gun pointed directly at you in a very small space. Corll had actually always taught him to act quickly and forcefully. Ironically, the mentorship that he had provided Henley served very well in this circumstance, because that is exactly what he did. He pulled that trigger. The bullet actually struck Corll in his forehead, didn't penetrate his skull, so obviously he was still alive. He lurches at Henley, and Henley just fires more shots. He strikes Corll in the left shoulder. And then as Corll tries to run naked from the room at this point, Henley fires more shots into his back. Corll hits the wall in the hallway and he slides down to the floor dead, face against the wall. Henley later stated this: "My only regret is that Dean isn't here now, so I could tell him what a good job I did killing him. He'd have been proud of the way I did it, if he wasn't proud before he died." Let's just look at that for a minute, guys. I could skip over this, but I can't because it's just so telling. "My only regret is that Dean isn't here now, so I could tell him what a good job I did killing him. He'd have been proud of the way I did it, if he wasn't proud before he died." So he's imagining there is a potential that as Corll was like sliding down the wall dead after being shot multiple times in his own place, that he would be thinking, "Damn, I taught that boy well." Like Henley, I know that Corll is a really serious psychopathic serial killer who definitely is better off dead. But I'm not imagining somebody with psychopathic narcissistic traits who's like, "Oh, I'm so proud he killed me." I think he would want to kill you, which is what ironically he was trying to do only 15 minutes earlier. But this is the mind of a psychopathic serial killer. They don't think the way that we do. We can all see that if you've been shot to death by somebody that was meant to be somebody that kind of you respected and liked and brought up in a certain way and offered opportunities, albeit mentorship in the most horrible murders, you're still going to be really angry that they decided to betray you and kill you, albeit that you were doing that to them moments earlier. But he believes, this young Henley, that somehow his mentor would be proud. How wrong he would be. But also, how twisted is that mentality? Now, after this is played out, Henley obviously has to call the police. He has a dead body and two traumatized young adults in the apartment. And he actually says, "Get over here now, I've killed a man." When the officers do arrive, there are three teenagers who they find sitting outside the apartment. They've got the gun on the floor nearby. Inside the apartment, of course, they find Corll's dead body. And at this point, they search the apartment and obviously find some incredibly disturbing items. They find the handcuffs, they find the torture bed, they find those horrible thin glass rods that he inserts in the penises of their victims before smashing them, several dildos, they find hunting knives, they find an electric motor with loose wires attached. Also, they find that the floor in the front room has been covered by thick plastic sheeting. They find wooden crates that are found in Corll's van and backyard, and the analysis of those would later find strands of human hair in them. Now, Rhonda and Tim would literally be a handful of people that visited Corll's apartment and actually lived to tell the tale. And you won't be surprised to know that Rhonda suffered multi-layered PTSD that was right up until her death when she was 61 in September 2019. And poor Tim, years later, would tell reporters this: "It was one day of my life. I have two choices: either accept it and move on, or kill myself." But Tim actually did kill himself when he was 55. So even though that reprehensible serial killer didn't get him that day, it seems the impact that he had on that poor man played out over the years to a point where he actually killed himself. The police questioned Henley, and he actually confessed to everything during the last 2.5 years. Initially, the police actually weren't convinced. They thought they were dealing with one murder, which was Corll's, but it feels like Henley just wanted to absolve himself of what he was carrying. He wanted people to know who he'd been involved with killing. And I wonder why Henley decides to tell the police at this point. I would imagine that part of it is there was a tiny bit of conscience there. Remember how he was with Rhonda, and the fact that suddenly he realises he's literally had most of his friends murdered. But also we have to note that he was quite proud of killing Corll. So maybe he also, like many infamous serial killers, want to be associated with the deaths that they've caused, and otherwise Corll would get all of that notoriety, so to speak. But when Henley starts telling them about who's gone missing, obviously the police check the names and they realised that they were all missing as reported. Henley eventually took the investigators to 3 mass burial sites. One was at Southwest Boat Storage. In here they found sacks of lime and also a bag of teenage boys' clothes. They actually found 17 bodies, so they were ultimately recovered from that site. At Sam Rayburn Lake, they found 4 bodies, and at High Island Beach, they found another 6 bodies. It must have been absolutely chilling to the bone for these police officers. All of the bodies were naked. Most were wrapped in plastic sheeting. As was noted when I talked about the murders, they found that some had been shot, some had been strangled. There were ligatures that were still wrapped around necks. There was lots of signs of sexual torture. In fact, in some cases, genitals had been mutilated. In one case, they were completely severed. In an analysis of another victim's body, it suggested that their genitals had literally been bitten off in one bite. They found objects inserted in their rectums. Most of the young men were still gagged. Some of the bodies were so badly decomposed that there really wasn't a lot to go on, and others were literally nothing more than lumps of putrefied flesh. Also, when Henley was questioned, and he was obviously cooperating with the police, he told them about Brooks's involvement, said that he was an accomplice. And Brooks did admit his involvement in procuring the boys for Corll, but he denied being active in any of the actual killings themselves. Those killings would later become known as the Houston mass murders. In total, 28 victims would be identified. And at that time, like I said earlier on, Corll became the most prolific serial killer in US history. And I think we can all agree, the chances are that he had a much higher figure, because he killed those first young boys that Brooks witnessed, the first boys that we came into contact in this story, where he walked in unannounced and saw them tied up. He found out off Corll that he'd murdered them a few days afterwards, but the likelihood is that wasn't the first time that Corll had actually carried out crimes. So I think we can all agree that there will have been more deaths. And in 2012, a Polaroid picture of a possible 29th victim was found among Henley's stored belongings. That was a young boy in handcuffs who clearly looks terrified. alongside him also you can see there was a toolbox in which Corll stored his torture implements. Now, even though Corll's dead, obviously Henley and Brooks need to stand trial. So July 1974, Henley stands trial in San Antonio. He's charged with 6 counts of murder. It was accepted, and rightfully so it was accepted, that his killing of Corll had been self-defense, so that wasn't included. His version of events in this regard was absolutely corroborated by Rhonda and Tim. So they know that he didn't go out of his way to kill Corll. It happened as a byproduct of Corll trying to kill Rhonda and Tim and him. Ultimately, he gets convicted on all the counts. The jury took less than 2 hours to reach the verdict, and he got 99 years for every murder. So they needed to be served consecutively. That meant that there was going to be a total of 594 years. Now, he did successfully appeal his conviction, and the reason for this is he said that the jury had been unfairly prejudiced. I don't know how. You procured poor young men, had them brought to the place where Corll was waiting for them. You actually helped murder them, and you kept procuring them without telling anybody. But you think that the jury were... What were they prejudiced about? Was it that you were a depraved, murdering, reprehensible psychopath who definitely deserves to go to prison forever? Was that the prejudice? Because I'm pretty sure no matter which way you spin this story, you're still going to end up with being guilty and having to serve life. Surely. Anyway, they give him a retrial, and again, unsurprisingly, is found guilty. 1979 that happens, and he's failed in numerous parole applications. This goes back all the way to 1980. He will, shockingly and surprisingly and scarily, actually next be eligible for parole in 2025, but I genuinely am doubtful that he will ever see the light of day, really. I mean, the amount of killing he was involved in makes him somebody who that's certainly not going to be safe to walk the streets. Brooks's trial, well, that began in February 1975. So he faced a single charge for the murder of 15-year-old William Ray Lawrence. William had been abused and tortured for 3 days before finally being strangled to death. Now, the jury were not convinced by Brooks' claim that he hadn't been an active participant. They found him guilty again after less than 2 hours, and they literally probably were like, we best look like we're considering the evidence in a way that makes us look like we need to explore it more than just going guilty as hell. But they took less than 2 hours, which is still a very small amount of time. He ended up receiving a life sentence, and one of the things that onlookers said was he showed absolutely no emotion when the verdict was passed. Could that be because he's not capable of emotion? Let's just throw that one in there. He actually died of COVID-19 related issues in May 2020. He was 65 years of age, so at least he's never going to get out. Now, over the years, this is as DNA testing has advanced, the medical examiners have actually been able to positively identify more victims' remains. So in 1994, this is early DNA testing, it concluded that one of the bodies found in the boat shed was Mark Scott's. He was murdered in April 1972. His remains were given to the family, and it turned out they made a mistake. So this testing suggested that they could, shall we say, bring a young man home, and they got it wrong. And the remains were actually those of Stephen Sickman. He'd been killed in July 1972. Turns out that Mark's remains have never been found. But you can't imagine how tragic that would be for the family to think that they'd at least been able to put their child to rest, and then turns out it's the wrong person. As I come to the end of telling you this particularly gruesome tale, I think the brutality of the Houston mass murders just cannot be overemphasized, and nor can the incompetence, the sheer incompetence of the police at the time. I mean, okay, they can be forgiven in part for not initially identifying Corll as the sexual predator he was. I mean, he'd never been on the police radar. His record was completely clean. In the area that he had lived, a lot of people respected him. But I still think that even in the 70s, you would have thought that an adult man who was consistently hanging around with teenage boys, handing them sweets at least would have raised some kind of eyebrows. Apparently not, though. But the thing that the authorities cannot be forgiven for is for missing the blindingly bloody obvious. I mean, namely, when you think about what I've told you, and I know your frustration will be as clear as mine is, the unexplained disappearance of more than 24 young men and boys. 24 young men and boys, at least 20 of which had been residents of either Houston Heights or the adjoining neighbourhood. Or Houston residents, in fact, who'd been around Houston Heights right before they went missing. All of them had vanished between December 1970 and July 1973. 11 of those children that I've talked about had attended the same school. And yet police were like, yeah, they're all runaways. This is despite constant appeals from the parents who knew them and loved them and knew they wouldn't run away. You know, they said their children would not run away. There was no cause for them to run away. The leads that they were given, they didn't follow. So when people came forward with information, the police just disregarded it. And if they'd made just some very rudimentary, simple checks, lots of lives could have been saved. It was their insensitivity to these distraught families who had lost the children that they adored, who knew that something terrible had happened. It was their insensitivity to these distraught families that takes the biscuit, isn't it? It is astounding. You know, a case in point concerned the parents of Stephen Sickman. So after the news of the mass murders came out, his mother actually constantly pressed the police for any information about her son. And the reason for this is because we know they'd initially failed to investigate his disappearance. How did they respond to this mother who'd lost her child, who knew that this had happened, who knew he was a victim, who wanted answers? What they treated her like was, when she called, to just start hanging up on her calls. That was the respect they showed this poor woman. It's so tragic for the families of these victims. And the parents of those victims are either dead or they're well into their 80s and 90s. And for the most part, they're not technically savvy. And this means that even though it's so many years since these children were taken, that some of those parents still handwrite letters to investigators. They handwrite letters to ask, has my child's remains been found yet? Even now, all these years later. Isn't that just awful? It just shows you the love of a parent is just forever, isn't it? Doesn't matter how many years pass, you'll always remember your child the last day you saw them, frozen in time, and all you want is for them to be brought home for you, even if that's just their remains. As for Henley, well, he's appeared in documentaries. Now, of course, he claims to be reformed. Of course you do. Of course you're reformed. He reckons he was under Corll's spell. Corll wasn't Merlin. He wasn't a magician. He wasn't a witch. He was just a man. There was no spell. You were fully engaged with what happened. Now, I'm the first person, you will have seen me on previous videos talk about it being important to always try to give young people a second chance. I agree with that. And usually I think that everyone is entitled to a second chance when they are young. There are exceptions though. I think that and I would hope most of you agree, that Henley is one of those massive exceptions. Listen, even though he was a teenager himself, his actions far exceeded just procuring victims for Corll. He's a serial killer in his own right. He targeted his friends, his acquaintances, people who trusted him. He enjoyed causing them pain and fear, like he thought nothing of taking their lives. Then he buried their bodies and watched their families suffer. He watched them search for their missing children, and he did all of this for enjoyment and for financial gain. According to Henley, we are to believe he heroically saved his two friends at the end. Really? Did you? I'm pretty sure you were telling Rhonda that you were going to lie her down, quietly chat to her before shooting her through the head, and you were quite happy for him to torture Tim to your right the whole time. He had taken both of those to that place of death. Rhonda and Tim were taken to their doom. They got lucky. I appreciate that. Also, it can't be a coincidence that he chose to kill Corll on the one occasion that Corll threatened to kill him. Was it that he was actually fearing suffering the same fate as the countless young men he'd helped kill? That's more likely, isn't it? He was like, I don't think I can trust this guy now. I better kill him because otherwise I'm probably going to end up dead. Now, whether or not Henley is truly reformed and genuinely remorseful for his actions, I don't really care. I don't. If he is, and I hope he is, I hope he's really remorseful because he damn well needs to be. I don't really want to ever see him getting out of prison. Even if he's changed and transformed, well, he still should die inside. He didn't afford his victims a life. Why should he get one? For me, what matters about this case more than anything, much like with many of those I've covered, is we must never forget the lives that he helped extinguish, the countless other lives that he impacted on and that he destroyed as a result. Because that's what happens when you kill somebody. That's what happens when you take somebody's life. It isn't just the person who isn't allowed to thrive and live a future. It's the impact on every single person who loves them. You literally transform a family. You break hearts. You ultimately, in this case, see parents dying early because they cannot manage the pain that's been manifested. That's the thing about human life. We talk about body counts, we talk about murders, and sometimes we can desensitize ourselves to actually what we're talking about. But we're talking about, just like you or I now, somebody snuffing out our lives and the impact that would have on those around us. Or even worse, snuffing out one of our children's lives. Imagining just for a moment, even in the blink of an eye, to envisage the pain that that would cause and then step away because it's too big, it's too overwhelming, it's too terrifying to imagine. That's what these people did to many. So as always, it's just that reminder that all those young men are the true victims here. And the spider web of connection that their lives had great meaning to for all the family members that they left behind, all have been impacted on because of the reprehensible nature of these crimes. Dean Corll is a horrific, horrifying, terrifying excuse for a human being. But he was more successful because he was able to find others who replicated that dark mindset, that psychopathic, narcissistic, willing to do whatever it takes to benefit the self type of mindsets that he found in Brooks and Henley. Let's hope that Henley never ever sees the light of freedom. And let's hope that at least Corll is burning in hell right now. I imagine he will be, for eternity. The jury's out on Brooks. I don't make those decisions, but I'm pretty sure it would definitely be a full lift down where Corll is concerned. Take care. Thank you so much for listening. Let me know your thoughts on this. Did you know this case? Is it one that you know a lot about? Or like me, have you kind of stayed away reading about it because it is so terrifying? Did you not know at all? Have I taught you something that you were unaware of? I love listening. Leave a comment, a like, get that subscription on if you are new to my channel. Remember, I release content on a Wednesday and a Sunday religiously. Crime and content, I'm your girl. I'm your channel. Take care, my lovelies. Be safe.